The sound that silenced the room wasn't a toast or a crash of thunder. It was a whiskey glass hitting marble. One clean, violent shatter, and then absolute nothing. $400,000 worth of wedding decor, a jazz quartet, 60 conversations, all of it swallowed by silence in the same instant. I turned slowly toward the sound. An elderly man near the entrance had gone the color of old ash. He was shaking, not from age. His eyes were locked on me with the intensity of someone watching a building they thought had collapsed years ago suddenly standing in front of them again. His lips moved before sound came out. "My God," he breathed, "she's the Iron Widow." You could feel the oxygen leave the room. My father, standing 6 feet to my right, stopped mid-sentence. My mother's hand froze at her necklace. My sister Elaine, the bride, stopped smiling for the first time all day. And somewhere behind me, a server quietly set down a champagne tray to avoid making any sound at all. The funny thing is, I'd spent the last 14 years being completely invisible to this family, especially after the wars, especially after I came home carrying things no one here had the vocabulary for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Kara Merritt. I'm 37 years old, retired Navy Special Operations Support Command, though most of what I actually did still doesn't exist in any public file. I live outside Virginia Beach with a stubborn old rescue dog named Hatch and more square footage of silence than most people could stand. And 3 days before my sister's wedding, I almost didn't board the plane. I was standing in my kitchen staring at the invitation I'd magneted to the refrigerator 6 weeks earlier. It had been there long enough to curl at the corners. I'd looked at it every morning. I'd talked myself into going. I'd talked myself back out. I'd bought the ticket. I'd considered losing it. When my phone buzzed, I already knew who it was before I looked. "Mom." I let it ring twice before answering. "You're coming Friday, right?" No greeting, just the nervous question. "Already bought the ticket." A pause, careful as a held breath. "Your father's been asking." Asking, that was one way to say it. My father didn't ask things. He calculated them. Whether I showed up was a variable that could embarrass him or go unnoticed, and he'd been running that equation about me for over a decade. "Tell him I'll be there," I said. Another pause. "You'll stay here at the house." "I booked a hotel." She didn't argue, she understood. We'd both learned over the years that some distances are easier to maintain when they're literal. My mother started speaking carefully around me after my second deployment, the way you speak around someone who might startle, slow, soft, no sudden movements. It wasn't her fault. She didn't know what she was navigating. None of them did because I never told them. Classified work becomes a wall eventually. You stop trying to explain and silence becomes the default language. After long enough, it becomes the only one. My father's voice from 6 years earlier lived in my memory the way some sounds do. Precise, permanent. We'd been standing in my parents' kitchen. I'd been stateside for 11 days after my final deployment. My hands still shook when I reached for things. I couldn't sleep past 3 in the morning. Loud noises made my chest seize up like a fist closing. He'd watched me across the dinner table for a long time before he finally said it. "You came back as someone else. Whatever was left of my daughter didn't make it home." At the time, standing in that kitchen in civilian clothes that still felt like a costume, I thought maybe he was right. By Friday afternoon, I was driving through my hometown outside Charlottesville with both hands at 10 and 2. Everything looked smaller than memory made it. The grocery store. The old diner where my ex-husband proposed before either of us understood what a military marriage actually costs people. The high school where I played varsity soccer and nobody would have guessed where I'd end up. I checked into a Marriott near the interstate rather than driving straight to the house. Tactical, some might say. I preferred to think of it as knowing my own limits. The rehearsal dinner was at a waterfront restaurant overlooking the river. White string lights everywhere. Jazz drifting through open doors. The kind of venue that announces money before anyone opens their mouths. The groom's family had money. Not recent money. Old Virginia money, the kind built quietly on defense contracts and political relationships and real estate bought before anyone knew the city would grow that direction. My father had spent his entire adult life trying to orbit people like this. Elaine's wedding was the closest he'd ever gotten. My sister found me before anyone else did. "Kara," she crossed the room in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my truck. She hugged. Me with the careful uncertainty of someone who doesn't know if they'll be hugged back. You actually came. You sent me 6 reminders. A small, nervous laugh. Elaine and I had been close once, before life split us into different categories. She became the warm one, the easy one, the daughter who called home on Sundays and hosted Thanksgiving and cried at commercials. I became the one people discussed in lowered voices when they thought I wasn't listening. How do I look? She asked. Like you haven't slept in 4 days. That's not. It looks good on you, I said. You look happy. She did, that was the truth. Whatever else complicated my feelings about that weekend, my sister was genuinely happy, and that mattered. Then my father materialized beside us, bourbon in hand, already wearing the expression I'd driven 4 hours expecting. Harold Walker at 69, broader than he used to be, louder than he needed to be, and carrying the particular energy of a man performing confidence for an audience. He looked me up and down, the charcoal suit I'd chosen deliberately for its complete lack of anything that would draw attention. Then he said his first words to me in 8 months. You couldn't put on a dress for one evening. There it was, 53 seconds. I'm wearing what I own, I said. The Marchetti family is going to be here. Robert Marchetti worked in the Pentagon for 20 years. Wonderful. Elaine stepped between us. Dad, please. But he had already said the thing he needed to say, and I had already absorbed it the way I'd learned to absorb everything in that family, without flinching visibly, without letting it reach anything vital. He spent the next hour introducing me to guests like an asterisk attached to a footnote. This is my older daughter, Kara. She was in the military, was, never served, never sacrificed, just was, like it was something I'd briefly tried before moving on to something more relevant. I overheard one woman near the bar murmur to another, she looks like she's somewhere else entirely. The other woman replied, softer, she looks like she's carrying something heavy. That one hit closer than she knew. An hour into dinner, I realized no one had saved me a seat at the family table. Not an oversight, not an accident. I stood there with my wine glass while relatives moved carefully around me like water around a rock. Elaine noticed from across the room, and her expression collapsed. I thought, Mom. It's fine, I said quietly. And the thing is, it was. Humiliation stops reaching you after combat. Once you've handed folded flags to people who will never recover from what you're handing them, the social embarrassments of family dinners lose their power entirely. But something inside me felt the particular exhaustion of things that never change. Later, my father found me outside near the water before I could make it to my car. The river reflected the lights in long silver ribbons. Tomorrow has to go perfectly, he said. It will. You know people find you unsettling. I looked at the water. You're always scanning, always on alert, it makes people uncomfortable. He paused. You walk around like half of you is still overseas somewhere. He wasn't wrong. Get some sleep, Dad, I said, and walked to my car before he could see my face. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the hotel bathroom mirror at 6:30 and looked at a woman I recognized but didn't entirely know anymore. Not because I'd aged poorly. Because aging is something you do while living, and some years I'd been doing something closer to surviving. The overhead light caught the faint scar below my left ear. My posture, even in silence, was still the posture of someone expecting things to go wrong. Military doesn't leave the body even when it leaves the calendar. On the bathroom counter sat a small velvet box. Inside was my Navy Cross. I'd considered bringing it. I looked at it for a long time, then I laughed at myself and put it back in my bag. The Whitmore Country Club looked like something from an old political film. White columns, stone fountains, valets in pressed uniforms. The kind of place that makes you feel slightly underdressed regardless of what you're wearing. Inside, the ballroom hummed with expensive conversations and soft piano. I felt the shift immediately, the subtle recalibration that happens in rooms when someone with a certain kind of presence enters. Not fear, instinct. A man near the door glanced at my hands, at my posture. Then he quietly stepped to the side without knowing he'd done it. Combat veterans recognize each other. Sometimes civilians do too. They don't know what they're sensing, but they move. Elaine found me near the entrance. She looked genuinely beautiful, not just the dress, but the particular radiance of someone on the best day they can currently imagine. You came, she said softly. You'd have been devastated otherwise. I'd have survived. You would. Not. She smiled, then glanced at my suit with familiar hesitation. You could have worn a. Please don't. My mother arrived in a rush, adjusting my jacket collar before I could stop her. You look thin. You've said that every year since 2009. Because it's been true every year since 2009. Her eyes softened suddenly, dropping her voice. You sleeping. Sometimes. She nodded like that answered more than I meant it to. Then my father appeared, steering me across the ballroom with a hand at my back toward a cluster of guests near the tall windows. Come meet the Marchettis, and please try not to be intense. I was going to say distant. The Marchetti family looked exactly like old Virginia wealth looks. Careful elegance, controlled warmth, watches that cost more than cars. Robert Marchetti stood at the center speaking with two other men about acquisition contracts. Silver hair, late 60s, the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where decisions got made. The groom, Nathan, noticed us first. Mr. Walker, he had good manners, genuine ones. My father transformed instantly, bigger smile, louder handshake. Nathan, the ceremony was beautiful. It hasn't happened yet, sir. Dad laughed too loudly. I watched the woman beside Marchetti politely pretend not to notice. This is my older daughter, Cara, Dad announced. She was in the military for a while. 14 years, 3 deployments, 2 classified commendations, 1 divorce, 16 funerals, but sure for a while. An older woman tilted her head at me. Army, Navy, how interesting. You certainly carry yourself differently, dear. A man to her left chuckled. She looks like she'd know what to do in a crisis. Most situations, yes, I said evenly. Robert Marchetti had been half listening while watching the doors. Then his eyes moved to me and stopped, dropped briefly to my wrist, to the small trident tattoo barely visible beneath my cuff. I watched it happen the way I'd watched similar moments happen before. The slow drain of color from a face, the parting of lips around a word that hasn't formed yet. Genuine shock, not the performed kind. No, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone. My father frowned, Robert. But Marchetti was still staring at me with the expression of a man who'd heard a name in classified briefings for years, and had just seen that name materialize in a wedding reception. Commander Merritt, he said. The room temperature dropped 3 degrees. Not because he knew my name, because he knew my rank. My father went very still. You two have met. No, Marchetti said, not moving his eyes from mine, but I know who she is. Every nerve in my body wanted to leave, not from shame, from exhaustion. I hated this part, the mythology people built around survival, the way civilians confused endurance with something cinematic. Today is my sister's wedding, I said quietly, please. Marchetti heard me, he nodded slightly, but something had already crossed his face that the room had caught. My father, completely lost, looked between us. What's happening? And Robert Marchetti, Defense Department contractor, former Pentagon liaison, man who'd attended 100 briefings that most Americans would never be cleared for, swallowed once, and said 4 words that turned the entire ballroom to stone. She's the Iron Widow. The silence was the kind that has weight. Not dramatic silence, heavy silence. The kind that settles when a room full of people suddenly understands that something real is standing among them. My father gave a short, confused laugh. The what? Marchetti wasn't performing. That was the thing about men who truly knew war, they never romanticized it. He looked like a memory had just walked back into his life wearing civilian clothes and a tailored suit. You genuinely don't know who your daughter is, he said. It wasn't accusatory, it was disbelief. I know exactly who my daughter is, Dad said. Elaine appeared, reading the room immediately. What's going on? Nothing, I said. But Marchetti's voice had lowered, and the guests nearest to us had gone very still. I spent years working alongside Naval Special Warfare procurement. There were names that came up, not in press releases, in the rooms where the real conversations happened. There's no need, I said. He looked at me. You're right. A pause, but your father just called you damaged. My father stiffened. I said no such. You said the war destroyed her. I was standing 12 feet away. The room was listening, not pretending not to, actually listening. Dad's face shifted through 3 different emotions before landing on something that looked like defensive confusion. She came home different, he said quietly. Her marriage ended, she stopped. She came home from Kandahar, Marchetti said. That word landed in the room like a stone into still water. I looked down at my hands, specifically from an operation that your government buried. Under so much paperwork that even the men who survived it can't discuss the details publicly. Marchetti's voice had gone careful, controlled. Sir, I don't know what stories you told yourself about your daughter over the years, but the people I worked with, generals, intelligence directors, men who don't cry easily, they talked about her in the past tense long before she came home. My father blinked because they thought she was dead. Because they couldn't believe she wasn't. The piano in the far corner of the room had stopped. Elaine was shaking slightly. Kara, what does he mean? I stared at the floor for a long moment. Then a voice cut across the ballroom from somewhere near the reception tables. A voice with decades of authority settled into every syllable. Commander Merritt. I turned. Rear Admiral Thomas Kellner, retired. I hadn't seen him since 2015. In his mid-70s now, but still carrying himself with the particular gravity that doesn't retire when the rank does. When our eyes met, he straightened instinctively. And then he saluted me. Every veteran in the room reacted before they thought about it. Several older men rose from their chairs. The sound of chairs scraping marble in a silent ballroom is something I will never forget. My father stared like he was watching a film in a language he'd never learned. Kellner lowered his hand and crossed the room slowly. Didn't know you were stateside. Almost 2 years now, I said. He studied my face the way old commanders do, taking inventory. You look tired. You too, sir. That made him laugh, a real one, short and dry. Around us, guests were no longer pretending to look elsewhere. He turned to Elaine. Your sister kept people alive overseas. Simple, no decoration, more than you'll ever know the full count of. Elaine's eyes filled immediately. My mother pressed both hands to her mouth. My father said, barely above a whisper, you never told us any of this. I finally looked at him directly. You never asked. The words didn't come out hard, they came out tired, which landed harder. An older man approached from near the bar a few minutes later. Marine Corps veteran, the posture never fully leaves, I would know. Mid-70s, dark suit, a small pin on his lapel that I recognized. He stopped in front of me and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. My grandson served in Helmand province, he said quietly. He used to mention a woman they called widow, said she came back for people when no one else would. My chest tightened. He made it home, the man continued. His voice stayed steady but his jaw didn't. He took his own life 3 years later. A pause, but he made it home first, because of her, because of you. He gripped my shoulder once, brief, firm, then he walked back toward the bar. The ballroom noise felt far away after that. I needed air. I found my way through a side door onto a stone terrace overlooking the water. October air, cold enough to clear the head. I stood with both hands on the railing and listened to the distant sound of music and laughter drifting from inside. Weddings are strange when you've seen what I've seen. Not bad strange, just strange. Rooms full of people at their most deliberately hopeful. If you've spent years in the opposite of that, you can feel like you're watching something through glass. The door opened behind me. Elaine, still in her wedding dress, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. You disappeared. Needed a minute. She nodded and stood beside me. For a while, we just looked at the water. Then she asked, were you really that well known, over there? I laughed softly. Famous, no, known, somewhere between a rumor and a cautionary tale. They looked at you like you were a ghost. That's basically what a nickname like mine means. She turned toward me. Why did they call you that, the Iron Widow? I looked at the water for a long time before answering. Because I was usually the one bringing the dead home. She went quiet, the wind moved through the trees along the bank. I thought nicknames like that were about strength, she finally said. Sometimes they're about grief. The fearless ones usually come home in flag-draped boxes. The rest of us just keep moving because stopping isn't an option. She wiped at the corner of her eye carefully, trying not to ruin her makeup. Were you scared over there? The question caught me off guard, not because it was complicated, because it was so simple and no one had ever asked it before. Every single day. She shook her head. I can't picture it. That's the point. Fear looks different when the alternative is getting the people next to you killed. It doesn't go away, it just gets subordinated. She was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, I never asked you any of this before. You didn't know what to ask. I believed the version Dad told. Her voice went small. That you came back closed off, that the military hardened you. The military taught me things I couldn't have survived without, I said. The hardness was already there. I think I was born with more of it than most people. That's not a bad thing. Dad thought it was. She didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. We stood there for a moment longer, and then the doors opened again. My father. He looked like a man at the end of a very long internal argument with himself. He sat on the stone bench behind us and stared at his hands. How many? He said quietly. Then he paused, started again. How many people died on operations you ran? I looked at the sky. I stopped counting. He closed his eyes. It wasn't that I didn't care, I said. It was the opposite. Counting meant looking at each one individually every time. That's not something you survive indefinitely. I didn't know, he said. No. I should have asked. And yes. He nodded, not defensive, just absorbing. When you were a child, he said slowly, you cried when birds flew into the windows. You buried a squirrel in the backyard when you were 8 because you didn't want it left out alone. Elaine made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I remember that, I said. He looked at me. I keep trying to connect that little girl to the person those men described tonight, and I can't. You're not supposed to. People aren't consistent that way. They grow into whatever their life requires. The war required you to become something I didn't recognize. And yes. He was quiet for a long time. Then, and I interpreted not recognizing you as the war breaking you. You weren't the only one. That doesn't make it less wrong. His voice had gone rough. I told you the war destroyed you. I said it to your face, and you were already carrying things He stopped, cleared his throat. You were carrying things I can't even picture, and I handed you shame on top of it. No one said anything. Were you ever okay? He asked. After you came home, were there days that felt okay? I thought about that honestly. Some, fewer than I wanted, more than I expected. Did anyone help you? Anyone at all? I looked at the water, not really. I heard the breath leave him. I waited, I said. For a long time, I waited for someone in this family to ask me if I was all right, not to fix it, just to ask. He put his face in his hands. There's a specific kind of crying that older men do, quiet, contained, ashamed of itself. I'd seen it in war. I recognized it now. I failed you, he said. You didn't understand. I didn't try to understand, there's a difference. I didn't argue with that because he was right. Inside the ballroom, the DJ announced the father-daughter dance. Elaine looked up, wiping her face. That's us. She touched my arm before she went in, then it was just me and my father on the terrace in the October cold. He stood, didn't move toward the doors yet. I told myself, he said, for years that the military damaged you, that some fundamental part of you didn't make it back. I know. But tonight I watched a retired admiral stand up in a room full of people and salute my daughter. His voice broke slightly. And I realized I was the one who had the story wrong. The whole time, I had the story completely wrong. The guests were mostly gone by the time I made it back inside. Staff were dismantling centerpieces. The music had wound down to ambient sound. Elaine and Nathan were saying goodbye to the last relatives near the door, both of them glowing in the particular way people do at the end of the best day of their lives. My father found me near the side exit and nodded toward the room. 1 more minute. I followed him back into the nearly empty ballroom. My mother looked up from a conversation with distant relatives. Elaine turned. Dad stood in the center of the floor and looked around at the people remaining. I want to say something, he said. Everyone got quiet. He turned toward me. His voice was unsteady in a way I'd never heard from him in my life. I spent the last 14 years telling myself and anyone who would listen that the war destroyed my daughter. He paused. Tonight I found out that the war did something else entirely. It asked more of her than I will ever understand, and she delivered, repeatedly, at a cost I never bothered to ask about. My mother had tears running silently down her face. I told her she came home cold. I told her she came home as someone I didn't recognize. His jaw tightened. The truth is I was too small to see who she'd become. Dad, I said quietly, you don't have to. I do, he looked at me steadily. I'm sorry, Kara, not for a misunderstanding, for a choice I made repeatedly to see you as broken rather than ask you what it cost you to still be standing. The room was completely still. Then Elaine crossed the floor and put her arms around me. This time it wasn't careful or tentative. It was the grip of someone who'd missed me without knowing how to say. It. My mother joined us. My father last slowly, with the stiffness of a man doing something unfamiliar, put his arms around us all. We stood there in the middle of a half-dismantled ballroom for a long time. Robert Marchetti watched from near the bar. Before he left, he crossed to me one more time and said quietly, "There are people in Washington who still talk about you. They should talk about the ones who didn't come home." He nodded once. That's precisely why they do. I stayed in Virginia longer than I'd planned, longer than I'd stayed anywhere in years. My father started attending a support group for military families at the Veterans Center nearby, driven there initially by Elaine, then by something that looked, eventually, like genuine willingness. He called me the third week to tell me he'd sat in a circle with 15 other parents and spouses who had spent decades describing their veterans the same way he'd described me. Changed, closed off, hard to reach, not the same. None of us knew, he said on the phone. That's the thing, not one person in that room knew how to bring them back. Neither did we, I told him. That part goes both directions. One Saturday morning in November, we sat on his back porch with coffee while leaves gathered at the fence line. The yard looked the same as it had when I was a child. The old oak still dominated the left corner. The paint on the back steps still needed redoing. We sat in comfortable quiet for a long time, which was new. You seem different, he finally said. I'm not. Not broken different, lighter. I thought about that, maybe because someone's helping carry it now. He nodded slowly. Then after a while, with the morning light moving through the oak leaves and Hatch asleep under my chair, he said it. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just said it. I'm proud of you. I didn't answer right away. Looked out at the yard, the familiar fence, the old tree. Not for the medals, he added. Not for any of it specifically, just for not giving up on this family, even when we deserved to be given up on. I took a slow breath. You were worth coming back for, I said. And that, finally, was enough.